What if your life depended on the next harvest? What if every day was a battle against starvation, disease, and the elements? This wasn't the reality for kings or knights, but for the vast majority of people in the medieval era, the peasants. We're stepping into their mud-soaked world to witness a strength and resilience that has been forgotten by history. If this kind of slow, gentle history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you a sense of peace. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something oddly soothing about seeing who else is out there, drifting off to the same quiet tale. So go ahead, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan if you enjoy that soft, steady hum in the background. Get comfortable and let's begin. Out near the edge of the known world, this village has no name, or if it once did, no one remembers it now. It rests in a shallow dip in the land, somewhere in the forgotten middle of nowhere, a gentle wrinkle in the earth, far enough away to escape roads, records, or royal eyes. You wouldn't spot it on any map, if you even had one, which you don't. In this place, the world stops where the forest starts. The woods are dense and quiet, like an ancient thing that's only barely willing to share its space with you. The fields fan outward in uneven patches of brown and green, worked until they're tired, and then worked again. Somewhere north, there's a river. You've never laid eyes on it, but you've heard stories in the same reverent tone reserved for dragons or saints. This is where you were born and where you'll die, maybe 60 paces between one and the other. The houses lean and slouch, shaped by winters that have shoved against them for years. Their walls are made of wattle and daub, mud, straw, and sticks, all woven together and patched with whatever the season hasn't yet stolen. The thatched roofs sag under their own age, always dripping from a spot just out of reach. The village smells of damp wool, hearth smoke, and churned up soil, with a sour thread of livestock and a hint of rot. You barely notice anymore. It's simply the scent of life here. The road in isn't really a road at all, just 2 deep ruts in the mud where ox carts have passed often enough to carve their memory into the earth. No one important has used it in years, if ever. Most days go by in silence. A distant bell might chime from a chapel in another village, if the wind is right. Otherwise, time is kept by the sun's position, the creeping stretch of shadows across the field, or the familiar ache that settles into your back before midday. There are maybe a dozen families here, just enough to fill a small circle on feast days. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone also knows everyone's troubles, and they're politely ignored until ignoring them becomes impossible. The village elder, if you could really call him that, is a man named Tom, who once had a conversation with a monk and now cites it as the source of all his wisdom. No one challenges him. His hut still stands. His goat hasn't died. That's leadership enough for most. Nothing in this place is exact. There are no documents, no titles, no maps. Property lines are spoken of in terms like past the fallen elm or where the ground gets marshy. Disagreements are settled with a sigh, a few words, and sometimes a shared loaf of bread passed back and forth until no one feels like arguing anymore. There's no schoolhouse, no tavern, no inn. If a stranger turns up, it becomes the main topic of discussion for weeks. Where did they come from? What do they want? Are they cursed? Do they carry the sea on their skin? The arrival of someone new is both thrilling and faintly alarming. And no one leaves. Not truly. The idea of travel isn't so much a plan as a legend. You've heard of towns and cities, of buildings made of stone that reach 2 or even 3 stories high. But they belong to the same world as talking beasts or women who become birds. You can't yearn for a world you've never laid eyes on. The forest is thick. The hills stretch on forever. The roads, if they're real, are whispered about more for their thieves and misfortune than any promise they offer. And even if you somehow reached one of those far-off places, what then? You don't speak another dialect. You don't have coins. You don't know the rules. You don't even know how many winters you've lived through. So you remain. There's a kind of safety in what you know, even if it's rough, even if it's tedious, even if the roof leaks, the well runs low, and the same stew has been simmering for 3 days straight. There's comfort in repetition, in knowing exactly where the firewood is stacked, in knowing who to go to when your fence gives out, in knowing which patch of sky turns before the weather does, your cue to bring the sheep in early. You rise with the light, you sleep when it fades, you labour in the hours between. It's not much, but it's something. And somehow, in the steady rhythm of it all, there's a quiet kind of contentment, one that doesn't ask questions, one that doesn't need to grasp anything beyond what's visible from the top of the nearest hill. Now and then, you'll hear whispers of a war, a king's death, or a blazing star that frightened a village 5 days' walk from here. But such news rarely arrives in full, just fragments passed through too many lips to hold much weight. Their urgency fades somewhere between the merchant and the shepherd's cousin. Even time feels different in this place. The seasons don't turn like pages, they blur into one another. A soggy spring becomes a soaked summer. A sharp frost gives way to a winter that bites clean through your boots. You don't mark the years. You remember the harvests, the dry one, the flooded one, the one where the rye turned black and sick, the one where the barley was so heavy and full that even old Margery grinned for days. The steward keeps track. He comes to collect grain, ask questions, write in his little book. You answer cautiously, never with too much precision. He doesn't care for specifics. You've never laid eyes on the king. You're not sure what he actually does. But you know his name, and you speak it during prayers, just in case it makes a difference. Because here, where the map runs out, most things stay the same. And when they don't, it usually means something has gone wrong. Still, the fire crackles, the roof mostly holds, the cottage stays warm, and tomorrow the same sun will rise over the same hills. And for now, that's enough. In your lifetime, you'll walk hundreds of miles, but nearly all of them will trace the same few paths. Most people in the medieval countryside never ventured more than a handful of miles from where they were born, not because they lacked wonder or stamina or shoes, though shoes were often a privilege, but because the land beyond the next ridge never really felt like it belonged to them, and the idea of going to see it, that was about as realistic as growing wings. You were raised knowing the names of every strip of land between your doorstep and the edge of the field. You recognized every crooked stump on the path to the well. You could tell who passed by just by reading the depth and shape of the footprints in the muck. Everything beyond that became something closer to imagination. The village just 5 miles away might as well have been across the sea. You'd heard tales. Who married whom, who ran off with a goat, who claimed the priest snored during Mass, but you hadn't seen it with your own eyes, and you probably never would, because travel wasn't just hard, it was dangerous. Not dangerous in an exciting, heroic sense, dangerous in the slow, tiring, possibly deadly kind of way. Roads weren't clean paths marked with signs or dotted with inns. They were mostly narrow, muddy trails winding through forest and field and long, unsettling stretches of silence. No guides, no markers, just advice like, keep going until you reach the pine that leans like it's drunk, then turn past the rock shaped like a sleeping hog. And on those trails, danger waited. First, the forest. Medieval forests weren't charming. They weren't picturesque. They were thick, dim, snarled with roots, and filled with sounds you couldn't always explain. Boars, wolves, and people who didn't want to be seen. If you hadn't been raised in the woods, they had no use for you. Second, bandits. The landless, the desperate, the forgotten. People with nothing to lose and nothing to farm. Travellers were easy targets, especially if they looked even slightly well-fed. A man walking with confidence might be carrying silver. A woman walking alone might be carrying something else worth taking. You learned quickly that confidence wasn't protection. Third, getting lost. This wasn't some minor inconvenience. If you strayed from the path, no one was coming after you. Following a stream and hoping for the best wasn't a strategy, it was a gamble. You could walk for days without spotting another human being. Your body could vanish into the underbrush like mist. People wouldn't realize you were missing until the next feast day, when someone finally asked where you were, and someone else just shrugged. Then there were the more immediate concerns. If you wandered too far, who would tend your plot? Who would feed the goats? What if the steward arrived to collect taxes while you were gone? You couldn't explain an absence to a man with ink-stained hands and a list. Your obligations didn't pause just because you wanted to see what was beyond the hills. And even if somehow you reached another village, what then? No one was waiting for you. No one was thrilled to see a stranger. Outsiders meant trouble, illness, theft, strange ways of thinking. Your accent might be off, your sayings unfamiliar. You might even hold your spoon wrong. You'd be greeted with caution, if not outright hostility. Hospitality wasn't guaranteed. Food was tight. Sleeping space was already spoken for. The safest place was still home. Not because it offered real protection, but because it offered predictability. You knew which part of the roof would drip, which hen liked to stray, which neighbour might lend a tool without asking for one in return. Beyond that, no one owed you anything. Still, people did travel, occasionally. Not peasants for the most part, but traders, monks, messengers, people with a reason and often with protection. You might catch sight of them once or twice a year, rumbling through with carts piled high with wool or salted fish, leaving stories behind like smoke from a dying fire. They spoke of cities built from stone, where shops sold cinnamon and pepper, and the streets didn't melt into mud every time the clouds opened up. It sounded like something out of a tale. You listened closely, but didn't let yourself believe too much, because even if it was all real, what would you do in a place like that? You couldn't read, you had no coin, you wouldn't know the rules or what gestures meant what. A city like that could swallow you whole, and never notice you were missing. So, you stayed, not because you lacked courage, though some days fear crept in, but because there were things that couldn't wait. A fence leaning, a niece needing watching, a handful of barley drying by the hearth, and a dozen other chores that needed finishing before the sun dropped below the hills. And because, if you were honest, the world didn't need to be bigger than it was. The village was enough. It had its gossip and grudges, its weather and illnesses, its moments of laughter. It had the ring of distant bells, the turn of seasons, and the quiet satisfaction of making it through one more day. Sometimes you wondered what lay beyond the trees, but most days you just hoped the stew didn't scorch while you were fetching water. The village was enough. It had its gossip and quarrels, its weather and illness, its brief, flickering joys. It had the toll of distant bells, the slow spin of seasons, and the quiet satisfaction of enduring one more day. Sometimes you wondered what waited beyond the tree line, But most days, you just hoped the stew didn't catch while you were fetching water. Some people did leave, usually the desperate, the reckless, or the restless. Sometimes the hopeful. A young man might head off chasing work, or glory, or a reason worth dying for. He might return with a limp, or a tail, or not at all. And if he didn't, no one asked too many questions. They just shook their heads and said, "He went beyond the trees," like that was all anyone needed to know. And maybe, in a way, it was. For those who remained, life was narrow, but it was understood. You weren't alone, not really. You spent your days among kin, neighbours, livestock, and the land that held you. There was solace in routine, in old grievances, in knowing what to expect when you opened the door. You didn't need to cross an ocean to grasp the warmth of a fire, or taste cinnamon to appreciate sweet bread. You didn't need to roam a kingdom to feel love, or grief, or weariness, or hope. And as the years slipped by, as the joints stiffened and the children stretched taller than the garden gate, the urge to leave didn't vanish with sorrow, only with clarity. Some people were born to wander. You were born to remain. There is no blueprint, no architect, no tidy pile of timber awaiting construction, just earth and wood and whatever the land hasn't yet taken back. Your home isn't really a house, not in the way most people imagine one. It's more like a truce between shelter and weather, between labour and erosion, between what you needed and what the land grudgingly allowed. You start with the frame, rough-cut timbers from the closest trees, shaped by tools older than memory. The wood doesn't lie straight. It bows. It twists. But that's fine. So do your walls. Once the skeleton stands, you weave thin branches or pliable sticks between the beams, a method called wattle. It's not beautiful. It's not especially fast. But it stays together mostly, like everything else in your life. Then comes the daub. A thick mixture of mud, straw, manure, and water. You press it in by hand. You smear it over the gaps. You smooth it just enough to keep the wind from cutting through, and call it done. It dries slowly, cracks in the sun, and falls off in bits that must be patched again before winter sets in. The smell fades with time. Or maybe you just stop noticing. The roof is thatch. Bundles of dried straw tied tightly across the rafters. When first laid, it glows golden, almost beautiful. Then the rains come, then the birds come, then time, as it always does. The colour dulls, the edges unravel. Gaps appear in places you swore were solid. You start setting out buckets where you hoped you never would. You don't seal it, you don't treat it. You just keep patching until it feels like the entire roof is made of repairs. At some point, sleeping beneath a cart starts to seem reasonable. The floor is earth. You convince yourself it's packed hard. And it is, mostly. Years of feet, brooms, spills, and stomping have flattened it into something like permanence. But when it rains, it softens. When it freezes, it splits. When the goats come in for the night, it's anyone's guess what your bare feet might find. You might scatter rushes or straw to cover the mess. It helps for a while. Then the straw gets damp. Then it gets filthy. Then it breaks down into dust. You sweep it out and begin again. Or you don't. Eventually, the straw is the floor and you stop trying to change it. The windows, more accurately, holes in the wall, are fitted with wooden shutters that never quite sit flush and creak when the wind shifts. Glass is too costly, too rare, too delicate. So the wind comes through, the cold slips in, the sounds of pigs and owls drift through, and now and then the pigs and owls themselves. There's one door, usually hung a bit askew after the frost warped the frame. It fastens with a wooden peg or a bit of looped rope. Not for safety, there's little worth stealing, but to keep the chickens inside and the wind outside. Inside, the layout is best described as communal. One room, maybe two, if someone managed to tack on a lean-to or carve out a loft. But usually just one, where you sleep, eat, cook, mend, speak, argue, and quietly carry your hopes. Everyone lives here. Parents, children, a cousin or two, a grandparent, maybe a neighbour's child, whose parents are either ill, missing, or both. There's a hearth in the centre, made of stone, if you're fortunate. Clay, if you're not. The smoke escapes through a hole in the roof, more or less. There's no chimney. The air inside is always smoky, always a bit warm, a bit damp, and always tinged with the scent of stew that's been reheated far too many times. Furniture is minimal. A table, a bench, perhaps a stool, a chest, if someone in your family had a knack for carving, or happened to marry well. Beds are wooden frames filled with straw or feathers, shared more often than not, and always squeaky. Blankets are wool, coarse, heavy, rarely completely dry. There's storage tucked up in the rafters, garlic, onions, dried herbs, maybe even a small ham if the pig was generous that year. You can tell whether it's early winter or late spring just by the smell in the rafters. Sometimes it brings comfort, sometimes it reminds you just how close you are to going without. Animals live inside too, literally. The cow might sleep in the corner of the same room. Chickens roam through, maybe a goat. It's not ideal, it's not hygienic, but it is warm. You get used to the clucks, the shuffles, and the occasional startled bleat in the night. They become part of the house's ambient noise, like the wind brushing through the thatch or the slow, aching creak of timbers settling into place. Nothing is square. The floor sags. The roof leans. The walls bulge just slightly, like the whole house breathes with the changing weather. You repair what you're able. You ignore the rest. Every spring, you swear you'll fix that back wall. Every autumn, it's still slanting. This isn't a house meant to last forever. It's a house meant to survive the next storm. And for all its shortcomings, and there are plenty, it's home. You know where the draft sneaks in, and which sack to wedge into place to stop it. You know which rafter will hold the cooking pot, and which one groans when someone gets too close. You know how the sun slices through the slats in the afternoon, and where the dog likes to curl up and sleep. When strangers pass through, they see poverty, but you see labour, ingenuity, survival. A roof that still holds is a triumph. A fire still burning at dawn is grace. A dry patch of floor is treasure. And when you finally lie down at the end of the day, surrounded by snoring, stillness, smoke and straw, you feel something close to comfort. Not quite pride, but presence. This space is yours. It creaks, it leaks, it shifts with every strong wind, but it holds, and so do you. For the average medieval peasant, food wasn't an experience. It wasn't vibrant or varied or especially hot. It was more like a daily riddle that had to be solved over and over, with the same tired pieces and the same thin hope that something vaguely edible might emerge. Your kitchen, if you could call it that, was just a corner near the hearth in your single-room dwelling. There was no pantry, no tidy row of jars, no sunny windows lined with neatly tied herbs. There was a pot, a fire, and a short mental list of what hadn't spoiled yet. At the centre of nearly every meal was pottage, a sort of everlasting stew that lived in the pot and never truly stopped simmering. It was never entirely fresh, and never entirely gone. You added to it during the day. You dipped into it at night. You kept it warm as the seasons changed and hoped nothing unpleasant decided to grow in it when you weren't looking. What went into it depended entirely on what you had, which was usually very little. On a good day, pottage might include cabbage, leeks, barley, and a handful of dried legumes. Maybe a clove of garlic or an onion if the season had been kind. In the colder months, you relied on beans or peas stored from earlier harvests. And if fortune smiled, a scrap of salted pork might find its way in. More often, it was just the bone. Even that mattered. A single bone could be boiled for days, hoping it might still remember the taste of meat. The flavour was predictable, earthy, pale, more about warmth than taste. You didn't eat pottage because you loved it. You ate it because it was there. A warm meal wasn't indulgence. It was survival, made slightly softer. The pot itself was rarely clean. It might be wiped, scraped, but scrubbed, almost never. The next batch always carried the memory of the last. There were no spices to mask it, no vinegar to lift it, just a slow, steady dullness. A taste that felt like boiled memory. Bread was the other staple, not soft, golden, or inviting, but heavy, dense, and dark, usually made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat, the pale, fluffy kind, was for the wealthy. Peasants rarely saw it, let alone used it. The loaves were squat and solid. They didn't rise much. They crumbled fast. Leave one out overnight, and it could serve as a blunt instrument. Still, it filled your stomach and gave you something to dip into your stew. Sometimes the bread came from less than ideal sources, chaff, ground peas, or whatever was scraped from the miller's bin once the good flour was gone. In desperate times, people turned to bark, not figuratively. They stripped the inner layer from trees, ground it down, and mixed it with scraps of flour. The result was famine bread, bitter, dense, barely digestible. It sustained you, technically. When flour ran low, meals used trenchers, stale bread slices repurposed as plates. They soaked up stew, then were either eaten, fed to animals, or handed down to the next lowest person at the table. The bread knew its place. Meat was rare, exceptionally rare. Chickens laid eggs. Cows gave milk. Livestock wasn't dinner. It was an investment. You ate them only when there were no better options. And when you did, you used everything. Meat, fat, organs, bones. Blood became pudding. Fat was saved and rendered. The head might turn into broth. Waste was a luxury no one could afford. Pork was the most likely meat, when you had any. Pigs were practical. Their salted fat flavoured everything, turning otherwise bleak meals into something almost pleasant. But slaughtering a pig wasn't casual. It meant coordination, salting, curing, boiling, storing, weeks of preparation. If you lived near water, fishing was an option, but not a guarantee. Many lakes and rivers were controlled by local lords, and fishing without permission could cost you, sometimes more than coin. And when you could fish, it was for eels, small river fish, or anything that wouldn't spoil within hours. Salted herring, if you managed to trade for it, was considered a blessing. The church had its say in your diet too. Fridays, Lent, and various feast days meant no meat, so you switched to fish or went without. In one of the more creative theological loopholes, beaver tails were reclassified as fish, a bit of ecclesiastical flexibility that most people gratefully accepted. Milk was common, but fleeting. It spoiled fast, so you used it quickly, or turned it into butter or cheese. Butter was a luxury in some homes, meted out carefully. Cheese was hard, tart, and often quite dry. If you had wheels aging quietly in the corner, it meant your cow had been kind that season. Dairy was valuable, but not always friendly, and without refrigeration, it turned quickly. Sour milk was still used. Butter went rancid. Cheese grew mould. You ate it anyway. You just trimmed around the worst parts and hoped your stomach was tougher than whatever was living in the food. Drinks were uncomplicated, water wasn't always safe, its quality shifted with the season and with whatever your upstream neighbour had dumped in it. So ale became the norm. Weak ale, known as small beer, was brewed at home and consumed by everyone, children included. The alcohol content was low, just enough to kill off bacteria and take the sharpness off your thirst. If you had apples or pears, you might ferment cider. Wine was for nobles and clergy. Mead was uncommon. Milk was mostly for the young or the ill. So it was ale with breakfast, ale with supper, and ale to help you forget that tomorrow would taste almost exactly like today. Vegetables made up most of your diet. Cabbage, leeks, garlic, onions, turnips, carrots, though not the orange kind. Medieval carrots were pale or purple. Most were grown in small kitchen gardens, carefully tended and eaten from root to leaf. Turnip greens might be boiled for stew. Skins were tossed on the fire or worked into compost. Fruit was seasonal, mostly apples, maybe a handful of wild berries or the occasional plum. If dried properly, they lasted through winter. If not, they vanished quickly. Preserving food was hard. Sugar was wildly expensive. If you had bees, honey was gold, used sparingly as a sweetener. Otherwise, your meals stayed firmly in the savoury category, even if that mostly meant bland. Herbs were cultivated when you could manage it. Parsley, dill, mint, sage. They weren't added for taste so much as medicine or superstition. Some were believed to ward off sickness, others kept flies away. Once in a while they even made food taste better, but that was more of a bonus than a goal. Meals were communal, eaten on benches clustered around the fire. There were no courses, no recipe books, just a shared pot, a scrap of bread, and the quiet hope that tomorrow there'd still be something left to cook. You didn't complain. Complaining didn't thicken the stew. On feast days, a wedding, a saint's day, a good harvest, you might roast a bird or bake a pie. Not a flaky, buttery pie. A medieval pie was a hard, sealed crust meant to hold meat and keep it from spoiling. Spices were used when available, though they rarely were. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, maybe, if someone had bartered wisely. But most days weren't feasts. Most days were plain. You scraped the bottom of the bowl, you dipped your bread, you drank your ale, then leaned back, full enough to sleep, even if not truly full. There was comfort in the pattern, in knowing what the stew would taste like, in counting the remaining loaves, in watching the same hands stir the same pot by the same fire, as wind slipped through the walls and animals shuffled nearby. The stew bubbled, the bread cooled, and once again you had enough. If you were a medieval peasant, you didn't own much. Maybe a patch of soil, a few tools, a couple animals, and a lopsided house you built with your own hands. But none of it was truly yours. It all belonged to the Lord, not a king. Not some far-off mythical figure, just your local landholder, the one living up the hill in a slightly straighter house with marginally better meals and a roof that probably didn't drip on his bed. He owned the land, which meant he owned everything that touched it, including, to some extent, you. You were what's known as a villain. That's not an insult, it's a status. You worked the land, but you didn't possess it. You were tied to it. You couldn't leave without permission. You couldn't hand it down freely. You owed labour, goods, and loyalty. You weren't enslaved. But freedom, that was relative. Your connection to the Lord wasn't a dialogue. It was a debt. You didn't speak to him directly. You spoke to the steward, the man who ran the estate and, more importantly, kept detailed records of what everyone owed. And you owed plenty. Let's start with labour. A few days each week, more during busy seasons like harvest. You were expected to toil in the Lord's fields instead of your own. This was known as corvée labour. You didn't get paid, you didn't get thanked, just the satisfaction of knowing someone in the manor dined because you put in the work. Then there were the taxes, and they came in all forms. A chunk of your grain, a cut of your wool, a chicken here, some eggs there. If you brewed ale, the Lord wanted ale. If you had a pig, he wanted bacon. If you caught fish, well, guess who held the rights to the river? And it didn't stop with food. Use the mill, pay a toll, even though it was the only mill around. The Lord owned it. He set the price. Could you grind your own grain at home? Technically possible. Legally, absolutely not. That was often a punishable offence, because the Lord didn't just want a portion, he wanted oversight. Same with the oven. Most manors had a shared oven, one you paid to use. If you dared bake your bread at home and word got out, there could be penalties. You learned to do things properly, even if it was slower, pricier, and made no real sense. Then came the fees. Want to marry? Pay a fee. Inherit your father's land? Another fee. Move to a new village? Ask permission first. Then, yes, pay. Your livestock could be taxed, your tools, occasionally taxed. Your right to have children without permission, almost taxed. And what did you get in return? Well, the Lord was supposed to protect you, in theory. If bandits attacked, or if a rival noble invaded, the Lord had men-at-arms who could fight. If famine struck, he might distribute grain from his stores, though rarely for free. And if you had a legal dispute, say your neighbour's goat wandered into your garden and refused to leave, the Lord's court might settle it. Again, not for free. This was feudalism, a system of obligations and hierarchy wrapped in the language of loyalty and protection. In practice, it was a system of ownership. The land was everything. Those who owned it ruled. Those who worked it obeyed. The manor itself stood apart from the village, sometimes literally on higher ground. It might be built of stone or timber, larger than any peasant's dwelling, with a thatched roof packed so thick no wind dared sneak through. Inside were tapestries, long tables, servants bustling, and the Lord, of course, draped in wool trimmed with fur, dining on meals you could barely imagine and thinking very little about you. He may not have known your name, but he knew your numbers. How much barley you owed this season. How many eggs you'd pledged. Whether your son was old enough to be added to the labour rolls. Everything was tracked. Not by you couldn't read, but by the steward, the reeve, the bailiff. Men who carried wax tablets or scraps of parchment and came asking questions, and you learned, quickly, to answer with care. And if you failed to meet your obligations, there were consequences, fines, more goods taken, extra days added to your labour. In harsher cases, your tools might be seized, your land reclaimed, your house taken, your goats, your pride, all of it, gone. You didn't fight back, because resistance wasn't seen as bravery. It was seen as stupidity. And yet, strangely, the system held together, not because it was just, but because it was consistent. It had structure, predictable, if punishing. You knew what you had to give. You knew what was demanded. There was no confusion, no sudden changes, just a slow, relentless rhythm of take, take, take. And sometimes, just now and then, the Lord gave something in return. A feast day with free food, a holiday with no labour, a kind word tossed down from horseback. Not enough to even the scales, but just enough to keep them from collapsing. It was never friendship, but it was durable. Your Lord might be generous or petty, young or grey, absent or ever present, but he was always above you. You never questioned that. You bowed when he passed. You uncovered your head. You spoke the proper words, not because he earned them, but because peace was easier than punishment. And maybe, deep down, because a small part of you still wished that one day you might be seen, acknowledged, rewarded, lifted, if only slightly. It almost never happened, but that's how the system endured, not just through fear, but through the faintest whisper of hope. That, if you worked hard enough, obeyed long enough, prayed loud enough, something might finally shift. In the meantime, the steward kept walking. The reeve kept recording. The mill kept turning. And you kept sinking your hands into the earth, year after year, season after season. There was no retirement, no reward, no way up, only the quiet certainty that you had done your part. You had delivered what was expected. You had survived another year under the weight of someone else's name. And as long as the Lord was satisfied, you were allowed to keep going. Long before the Black Death tore through Europe and cemented itself in the pages of history, medieval peasants already knew sickness intimately, not just the kind of illness that came and went with the seasons, though there was plenty of that too, but the slow, lurking certainty that something, somewhere, was always waiting to go wrong. Infection, fever, swelling, wasting, coughing fits that wouldn't end. Disease wasn't an interruption, it was part of the background. You didn't need a plague to end up in bed, just a scratch, a flea bite, a sip of water that looked fine but wasn't. And unlike taxes or seasons, illness didn't follow a pattern. It showed up unannounced, and rarely left without taking something. There were no real hospitals, not in the way we think of them. If you were lucky, the village had a wise woman, maybe a midwife, someone who knew which roots to boil and which leaves to burn. If you were very lucky, there might be a monk nearby, literate, devout, and slightly more effective than pure hope. But most of the time, when you got sick, you stayed where you were. You lay down, you soaked your sheets with sweat, and you waited. People didn't understand disease, not really. The word germ didn't exist. Microscopes were still centuries away. What you had were theories, ancient ones, muddled, mystical, and usually wrong. Some believed in miasma, bad air that carried illness through stench. If your village smelled of rot, dung, and smoke, it was deemed dangerous, which, strangely enough, wasn't entirely wrong, just misunderstood. To fight the stench, people stuffed herbs in their collars, carried flowers, or pressed vinegar-soaked cloths to their faces. It didn't work, but it felt like protection, and that counted for something. Others saw sickness as divine punishment. Illness came from sin, from improper thoughts, from defiance or spiritual rot. If your child grew pale, it was a trial. If your crops failed and then your health did, it was penance. Maybe for you, maybe for your neighbour, maybe both. Local traditions had their own explanations. Some blamed the evil eye, a jealous glare from the wrong person. Others pointed to the moon, animal spirits, or a particularly moody saint. One widespread belief claimed sickness crept in through the soles of your feet. The remedy: boil them. If that didn't help, burn something, maybe your bedding. The cures could be just as odd as the causes. If you had a fever, you might be bled. A man would show up with a blade, a bowl, and far more confidence than actual training. Sometimes it was leeches, sometimes sharp stones. The idea was to balance your humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If they were out of alignment, so were you. No one had ever actually seen these humours, of course, but they were blamed for nearly everything. For swelling, there were poultices, thick smears of mashed herbs, clay, or even stale bread, wrapped in cloth and tied to the skin. Some helped, most didn't. A few made things worse. But the important part was that something was being done. If your stomach cramped, you might chew on charcoal. If you coughed up blood, wine mixed with crushed pearls was the prescription. If your vision blurred, someone might whisper a prayer while wafting smoke over your head. If your leg turned black, there were no more remedies. And then there were plague charms, bits of bone or metal worn around the neck, sometimes etched with sacred words, sometimes blessed by a priest. Some people buried onions in the corners of the house. Others strung garlic over the doorway. A popular folk remedy involved tying a live chicken to the infected area and hoping the disease would pass into the bird. It rarely worked. But hope was scarce, and people clung to whatever was left. Illness was isolating, but not in the way we think of now. There was no quarantine, no formal help to summon. You simply kept working until you couldn't, and when that day came, you lay down, and life around you kept going. Children were fed, animals were fed. You might be given broth, a damp cloth, a few quiet prayers. Sometimes you got better. The fever broke, the swelling faded. You stood again, slower, weaker, and far more grateful for hot soup. Other times you didn't, and someone lit a candle. Plague, in the broad sense, wasn't always the kind that filled carts with bodies. More often it was slow, a spreading blackness, a swelling limb, a cough that echoed through the house like a warning. Smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, even a harsh winter flu could flatten a village. There were no statistics, no records, just stories. A traveller might say the cough had started in the next town over, or someone whispered that 3 children had died near the river. You paid attention. You boiled your water. You tucked herbs into corners. You kept your distance, without needing to be told why. Death wasn't always feared, but it was known. People recognised its approach. They saw the signs, the slowing breath, the cooling skin, the distant look in the eyes. There were prayers for the dying, soft, steady words murmured by firelight. And when the Black Death finally arrived in the 14th century, it struck with a ferocity that made everything before feel like a rehearsal. But by then, the world already knew disease. The idea that you could wake well and be gone by night wasn't shocking. It was simply happening more often. The plague arrived in waves, and with each return, it came worse, stranger. Buboes blooming in the neck and groin, fevers that shattered the mind, blood that boiled beneath the skin. People died in days, sometimes in hours. Entire villages disappeared. Fields grew wild. Church bells tolled too often and too quietly. Some peasants tried to escape. But disease moves faster than footsteps. Others turned inward, praying harder, flagellating themselves, making desperate promises to live better if only they were spared. A few turned outward, in anger, blaming outsiders, blaming sinners, blaming anyone but the wind. The church gave answers. It offered comfort and burials. Monks fell by the hundreds. Priests vanished without ceremony. In some places, death became so familiar that funerals were abandoned altogether. Bodies were laid in mass graves, rarely named, and yet life continued. People figured out how to live alongside sickness. They accepted it the way they accepted hunger or cold, not gladly, but with a weary kind of persistence. Homes were scrubbed more often. Herbs were traded, shared, passed quietly between neighbours. New prayers were whispered into smoke and straw. Some believed surviving one illness would guard them from the next. Others believed nothing at all. But they still rose each morning and milked the cow. Children grew up knowing which plants burned the tongue, which ones soothed the gut, and which to boil until they stopped smelling like rotting boots. They knew how to clean a wound, how to watch a fever run its course, how to see when someone wasn't coming back, and when it was time to let go. And even through it all, they kept living. They married, they planted and reaped. They sat down to meals, simple but shared. They gathered near the fire and told stories of past sicknesses, like the time someone's grandfather survived a winter fever with nothing but garlic water and a refusal to die. Plague wasn't the end of the world. It was simply another part of it. And for those who endured, survival became its own quiet act of rebellion, a steady, stubborn refusal to vanish without a sound, a belief that tomorrow would come. And if it didn't, someone would remember your name, or at least the way you always added rosemary to the broth. Night in the medieval countryside wasn't peaceful. It was quiet the way a cave is quiet, full of creaks, distant rustling, and a stillness that makes you realize how loud your body actually is. The day ended when daylight vanished, and whatever wasn't already done had to be finished fast, because after darkness fell, the world collapsed down to the size of your hearth. There was no artificial light, no idle candles left burning into the small hours. Wax was far too precious. If you had a tallow lamp, you saved it for illness, childbirth, or prayer. Most nights, the fire faded. The coals pulsed softly, and that was all. And so, you slept. But not in the way we do now. Not in one long stretch. Medieval sleep came in two parts. A first sleep, a waking interval, then a second sleep. This wasn't strange. It was natural, a rhythm shaped by long unlit hours, dusk to dawn. You drifted into first sleep not long after nightfall. The fire would be banked, the animals would have settled, children would be hushed. The house, one room, maybe two, would stretch into a heavy stillness. If you had a mattress, it was stuffed with straw or feathers, usually lumpy, often shared. If not, you slept on woven rushes or straight on the packed earth, softened only by repetition. Everyone slept together, parents, children, relatives, sometimes servants, all sharing the same space. Not because of affection, but because of necessity. It was the only warm room in the home. On the coldest nights, even the animals came in. A goat near the threshold, a dog curled beside the hearth, chickens tucked into a basket. Warmth outweighed boundaries. There was no privacy. Sleeping alone was a punishment, not a luxury. The wealthy could afford solitude. Everyone else learned to adapt. You turned toward the wall. You stuffed straw into your ears. You shared what blankets there were. You breathed each other's breath. And if someone snored, and someone always did, you just learned to live with it. First sleep lasted several hours. Then, like the turning of a clock, people woke. It wasn't strange. It was part of the rhythm. This waking period, often near midnight, was quiet and still. Some used it for prayer. Others stirred the coals. Some stepped outside into the biting dark. Some whispered. Some just listened. It was a time for dreams, vivid ones. People believed this midnight hour blurred the lines between the living and the dead, between the earthly and the divine. If you dreamed during this in-between time, you remembered it, and you spoke of it the next morning, not casually, but as something important. Eventually, second sleep took hold, slower, heavier. This was the sleep that mended, or at least tried to. It was when the day's soreness eased, when cracked hands stopped throbbing for a little while. If you were lucky, it lasted. If not, you stayed still and waited for the grey edge of morning to give you permission to rise. The home never fell fully silent at night. The fire hissed and popped. Wind whispered through thatch. A child might stir. A cow might shift and breathe deep. Sometimes the silence cracked with coughing, the wet, hacking kind that always sounded worse in the dark. Everyone heard it. No one said a word. It was understood. Fear of the dark wasn't childish. It was earned. Night carried real threats, some imagined, some entirely tangible. Wolves, for instance. In certain regions, their howls came close enough to set your skin crawling. They weren't stories. They were out there, and they were hungry. Then there were thieves. Outlaws, wanderers, fires sparked from stray embers, roofs that sagged under snow, and stranger dangers, ghosts, spirits, witches, things that moved without sound. You didn't talk about them freely, but you knew they were there. To guard the home, you followed small rituals: a piece of iron by the door, a sign of the cross above the hearth, a whispered blessing over the straw mattress, herbs, rosemary, rue, sage, hung above doorways. Sometimes you tied a bit of string around a child's wrist, just in case. Even with precautions, many believed that sleep left you exposed, that the soul wandered while the body rested. So you tucked in with care. Mirrors were covered. Beds faced the fire. Feet were never pointed toward the door. The cold was its own kind of danger. It crept through walls, thatch, and crooked doors. People didn't sleep beneath heaps of soft bedding. They layered what they had: wool, cloaks, fur, extra tunics. The idea of changing clothes before bed would have seemed foolish. You slept in what you wore, sometimes even in your boots. There was comfort in sleeping beside others, but also discomfort. Someone always fidgeted, someone always muttered. There were elbows, knees, the occasional surprise from the dog, but this was the norm. You didn't expect silence, you expected company, and in that closeness you found a strange kind of safety. You heard your father's slow breathing, your child kick, your grandmother whisper prayers into the dark. It wasn't peaceful, but it was human, it was shared. And when you dreamed, those dreams mattered. A field of wheat might promise fortune, a snake meant illness, a broken tooth could foretell death. You learned to read these signs, or you asked someone who could. The village had its dream readers, not official, but understood. The church had its own warnings. Some dreams, it said, were traps, temptations sent by the devil, proof that sleep could be spiritually risky. You were told to pray before bed, to keep impure thoughts away, to keep your soul clean in case the night was your last, because sometimes it was. People closed their eyes and never opened them again. A fever might spike, a cough might deepen, and by morning someone was gone, quietly, as if taken. That uncertainty gave mornings a kind of quiet reverence. When the light returned, when the rooster cried out, when the coals were stirred back to life, it meant you'd made it. You sat up slowly, every bone reminding you of your years, no matter how few. The cold met your face. You wiped your eyes. You looked around and counted. Everyone who moved was present. Everyone who didn't was checked. And only once the living were tallied did the day truly begin. Water was fetched. Bread was shaped. Animals were fed. The dream you'd had, if it meant something, was spoken aloud, and the memory of the night began to fade, not vanished, just softened, folded into the next long stretch of time. In winter, sleep arrived early and lingered late. In summer, it shortened, but the rhythm remained. First sleep, a waking hour. Second sleep, a world without clocks, but not without structure. And despite the discomfort, there was something steady in that rhythm, something honest. You weren't aiming for comfort, you were aiming to endure, and if by chance rest found you along the way, a sliver of warmth, a night without noise, a dream that didn't leave you afraid, that was a gift, not questioned, not expected, just received. Some years you were simply hungry, other years you were in a famine, and those were not the same thing. Hunger could be managed, it followed rules. You stretched your food, you rationed, you waited, you hoped, but famine broke those rules. Famine meant the fields had failed, the root cellar was bare, and no one could pretend that next week might be better. Food became an idea, more than a presence. In a medieval village, you often saw it coming. It started in the spring, too much rain, or none at all. The barley sprouted in patches, the beans flowered and browned, the cabbages split too early, the wheat heads stayed small, bowed, as if mourning the harvest before it even arrived. You noticed. Everyone noticed. At first, no one said a word, but glances were exchanged, quiet calculations made. How much grain is left from last year? How much seed can we keep? How much can we afford to eat? The answers were never reassuring, and the cruelest part was that the hardest choices didn't come in winter, they came in summer, because that's when you had to choose. Plant the seed and hope for a harvest, or grind it into flour and feed your child today. You knew what each option meant. So the portions shrank. The stew grew thin. The loaves grew smaller. The bowls didn't come back empty. They just didn't come back as often. No one panicked. Not yet. You told yourself this had happened before, that another village might have more, that the Lord's stores would carry you through. Hope was still at the table. There just wasn't much else. By August, it got harder to ignore. By September, it was undeniable. You stopped feeding the animals first. The chickens went silent. The goat's bleating grew hollow. The dog, if you had one, stopped barking and started following you closer, like it understood its turn was coming. Bread became ceremony. One loaf, split 5 ways. Everyone chewed slower. No one spoke about the crust. Even the smallest crumb was treated like treasure. The stew was mostly water now. If it had any colour, it came from the pot itself. You boiled weeds, ground up roots, pulled up things you couldn't name, and hoped they weren't poison. Some weren't. You didn't sleep through the night. Not out of fear, but because your stomach reminded you every few hours it was still empty. The children stopped asking questions. That's when you knew it was real. No one asked when the bread was coming. No one asked for honey. No one begged for a story. They just sat by the fire and stared. They learned how to wait. And your neighbours? You stopped seeing them. The village fell quiet. No more laughter. No more arguments about sheep. Just the occasional cough or the sharp crack of firewood. Famine didn't make people cruel. It made them quiet. Sometimes someone returned with a rabbit, or a bird, or a handful of acorns that could be soaked and crushed. You chewed them, even bitter. You smiled, not because they tasted good, but because they were something. You tried not to resent the manna. Sometimes they sent grain, sometimes they didn't. The steward came by less and less. That was both a mercy and a warning. He wasn't there to take, but he wasn't there to give either. His silence said more than his words ever had. The church did what it could. Bread after Mass, alms for the poorest. But even they were strained. You prayed, not from faith, but from habit. When your hands had nothing left to do, your lips still moved. Some people left, packed up and wandered, looking for work or food or God. Some came back, some didn't. You didn't ask why. You were too tired. Famine changes the body. You feel your ribs, not with your fingers, but from the inside, like they're pressing outward. You rise slowly. You bruise without reason. You wake up with your hands clenched, gripping tools your muscles can't remember how to use. And the cold, it hurts more than it used to. The fire became your closest friend. You tended it more than you cooked with it. You sat beside it. You slept facing it. You fed it even when your stomach was empty, because heat was the last luxury you could afford. By now, you'd eaten everything edible. The roots, the weeds, the dried beans, the mouldy flour. You'd boiled bones until they gave nothing back. Soaked bark. Baked famine bread that cracked your tooth. And when even that was gone, you looked to things that weren't food, but might become food if you believed hard enough. Leather, boiled, salted, chewed, not nourishing, not satisfying, but chewable. You once found a rat. You didn't scream. You thanked God. Then you hid it, cooked it, and ate it alone. You still carry the guilt, but not the regret. Your dreams began to shift. You dreamed of feasts, roasted meats, fresh bread, wine that flowed. You woke up chewing your tongue. You dreamed of boiling pots again and again, even though the fire had gone cold days ago. You dreamed of green things, of animals returning, of childhood when hunger was simpler. And sometimes you dreamed of being full. Those dreams made you cry. The graveyard grew slowly, then quickly, then too quickly to keep pace. You knew someone had died when the church bell didn't ring. It meant there weren't enough hands to pull the rope. The grave was shallow, the prayer brief, the grief silent. Everyone had their own hunger to bear. You wanted to mourn, but you couldn't afford the emotion. You buried that too. Then, like all famines, it ended. Not suddenly, but gradually. The rain came and stayed. The ground softened. Seeds split. Shoots rose. Weak but alive. You had just enough strength to hope. You saved the first harvest for others. Children first, then the elders. You took the smallest bowl. You smiled as you passed it down. And when the first good loaf emerged from the oven, dark on the bottom, cracked on top, you just looked at it. You remembered every day you went without, every trick, every lie, every kindness. You ate slowly, and this time it filled you. By the time you could walk, the church already had your name, baptized before memory, blessed in a language you'd never understand. Your soul stitched into a system that stretched far beyond your village. You belonged to the church, not because you chose it, but because there was no alternative. In the still corners of your life, those grey mornings before the fire lit, those damp nights when the wind spoke through the shutters, you felt it. It wasn't beside your life. It shaped it. It judged. It forgave. It taxed. It defined what happened after you died. The church wasn't just a place. It was the air, the road, the structure of your calendar. It was the voice at your grave, and the one that whispered about it long before you got there. The village priest, often the only literate man for miles, was not just your confessor, he was your calendar, your advisor, your weather forecaster, and your only link to a world beyond fields and firewood. He carried stories of saints and signs in the sky. He knew why the crops failed, or said he did. He moved through the village like a man wrapped in both comfort and threat. You brought your sins to him in whispers, hoping he wouldn't look disappointed. You tried not to think about what he knew. You saw him at birth, at marriage, at death, 3 of the only guaranteed moments in a peasant's life. And in between, he spoke for a God you feared more than loved. Because love, you were told, was earned through obedience. Latin was the language of the mass, and it might as well have been a spell. You stood beside your family, feet numb with cold, listening to words that were never yours. You didn't understand what the priest said as he lifted the bread, but you believed, or tried to, that the bread was no longer bread, that the wine wasn't wine, that murmured words and careful gestures could bend heaven toward earth. You didn't speak the language, but it moved through you all the same. You mouthed what you could. You crossed yourself when others did. You followed the rhythm of reverence the way one follows a path to the well, not knowing every step, only that you needed to reach the end. The church told you when to fast and when to feast. It carved the year into sacred seasons, Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints. You didn't say March or April. You said after Easter or near St. Michael's. It told you what to eat, when to eat, and how guilty to feel about enjoying it. 40 days without meat before Easter, followed by a feast so rich it left you dizzy. Fish on Fridays, even if you lived nowhere near a river. Almond milk for the wealthy. Turnips and cold broth for everyone else. On Saints' days, you shared what you could. On fast days, you imagined what you couldn't. Even when your bowl was empty, your plate was full of rules. And the church calendar wasn't only about prayer, it was about payment. The church claimed 1/10 of your yield every year without exception. Grain, eggs, wool, chickens, cider. If it came from your field or your body, it had a price. You gave because it was God's share, or so you were told. But God didn't collect it. The priest did, or the steward, with his ink-stained fingers and his quiet nod. You watched your best barley disappear into the tithe barn, always larger than your house. You saw neighbours hand over their last sack of oats, while the priest offered prayers they had already paid for. And when the harvest failed, when the rains were too late or the frost too soon, the tithe remained unchanged. You owed what you owed. Sometimes they let you pay in candles or labour. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the debt bent your back, even when you stood tall. But the church didn't only take, it gave too, though not always what you needed. It gave stories, it gave structure, it gave reasons. When your cow died without cause, the priest told you which saint to petition. When your child burned with fever, he said it might be a test, or a punishment, or the devil slipping in through a crack in your belief. He gave blessings and sacraments, told you to light a candle, to make a pilgrimage, to wait. Sometimes he gave you a relic, a bone, a tooth, a scrap of cloth soaked in a martyr's blood. You held it like treasure. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but even when it didn't, it was something. There were saints for everything. Saint Apollonia for teeth, Saint Isidore for fields, Saint Sebastian for plague. You didn't know when they lived, or where, but you knew their names, and what they could fix. Their stories were half memory, half spell, shared in whispers and firelight by people who didn't know where truth ended and legend began. You called on them when you had no one else. You stirred their names into your soup. You muttered them in the fields. You bargained, bread, silence, a pilgrimage. Sometimes they answered, or seemed to, and that was enough to ask again. Pilgrimage was sacred, but also a reason to leave. You walked farther than the 5 miles that made up your whole world. You followed strange roads, chasing shrines you'd only heard about. You carried your prayers like weight, slept under hedges, knelt before bones and statues, waited for something to shift. Sometimes it did. You came home not healed, but changed, or at least tired enough to believe you had been. Even death was a rite, choreographed by the church. When you felt it draw near, you sent for the priest. He came with oil and Latin, anointed your forehead, spoke to your soul. He tried to guide you through whatever came next. Your family gathered. The candles were lit. The bell might ring, if someone could still lift the rope. You were buried in sacred ground, among others who had followed the same path. Then came the masses. Your family lit more candles, paid for more prayers, hoped the priest remembered your name. Because even in death, there were dues. The church taught that your soul might not rise at once, it might linger. In purgatory, a shadowed hallway between pain and peace. You could stay there for years, or centuries, unless someone helped, unless someone prayed, paid, lit enough candles, spoke your name often enough to pull you through. So your family paid what they could. The poor gave bread, the rich gave land, all in the hope of shortening a stay in a place no one had seen but everyone feared, because fear too was part of the church's gift. The church explained the world when nothing else could. It told you why the rains failed, why your child didn't wake, why illness took the young and spared the cruel. It told you that suffering had purpose, that obedience had reward. It gave shape to chaos, and that shape, even when it crushed you, brought a strange kind of peace, not comfort, but order, and sometimes that was enough. You didn't question the church's power, not seriously, not aloud. You might grumble about the tithe. You might curse when the priest looked the other way, but you still showed up. You still knelt. You still crossed yourself when the bell rang. Because if the church wasn't right, then the world had no shape at all, and a world with no shape was a terrifying thing. Even when the priest drank too much, even when the bishop demanded too many taxes, even when a wandering indulgence seller peddled promises like soap, you still believed, or at least you acted like you did. And in the end, that was mostly the same. Because belief wasn't about what you thought, it was about what you did. You didn't understand the Latin, but you understood the rhythm. You lived inside it because there was nowhere else to go, and when you died, you hoped the bells would ring, that the candles would burn, that your name would be said often enough to matter. You hoped the saints were still listening. You hoped your sins had been counted and forgiven in equal measure. You hoped the church, in all its weight and mystery and dust and gold, would carry you the rest of the way. You might think that after everything they endured, after the famines and the plagues, after the taxes and the tithes, after centuries beneath the heavy boot of the manna, peasants would have risen up more often. That suffering would have stacked too high. That something would crack. That one cold morning the frost would melt and the people would finally rise. That they'd gather in fields and markets, tools in hand, fire in their throats, shouting that they would kneel no more. But they didn't. Not often, not for long, and never all at once. Yes, there were uprisings. The Peasants' Revolt in England, 1381. The Jacquerie in France, a few decades earlier. Scattered fires across the continent. Brief flashes of defiance in places where the lords had pushed too hard, taxed one coin too many. Sometimes the spark caught. A tax collector's house burned. A steward fled town. A banner rose above the village green. But the fires burned fast, and were snuffed out faster. They ended in gallows, in pikes, in silence heavier than what came before. The world didn't change. The fields still needed sowing. The debts still needed paying. To understand why peasants didn't revolt more, you have to let go of the idea that they were ignorant or timid. They weren't. They were survivors, not of a single disaster, but of 1,000 quiet ones. They endured constant hardship, not a storm, but a climate. They didn't lack courage, they lacked margin. In a life spent patching roofs and stretching stew, there was no room for rebellion. You could plan an uprising, or you could dig potatoes. You couldn't do both. The truth is, the system worked. Not because it was kind, not because it was fair, but because it was old. It had settled into the soil. It didn't need justification, it simply was. You owed labour. You owed grain. You owed the church its tenth and the Lord his harvest. You owed silence when the reeve walked past your door, and in that silence history moved forward. Slowly, unevenly, but always forward. You were born into that owing, and unless fortune favoured you, you died in it too. But by staying within the lines, you could survive. Barely, but survival all the same. The cost of stepping outside the rules was simply too steep. The manor had its soldiers. The church had excommunication. The king didn't know your name, but his laws still held you like binding twine. The punishment for defiance wasn't always death. Sometimes it was worse: exile, starvation, or leaving your family with the debt you tried to escape. Everyone had heard the stories: a father taken, a mother whipped, a cousin who vanished after refusing to pay. These stories weren't told to provoke rebellion. They were told to prevent it, because rebellion didn't feel like an option. Not when the people beside you weren't strangers. They were family, neighbours. You shared fields, fences, tools, and prayers. Even if you despised the steward, you might marry his daughter. Even if you resented the tithe, you still brought bread to Mass. The village wasn't just where you lived. It was your whole world. And to tear it apart meant tearing yourself apart too. It's easy, centuries later, to picture the peasant as forever bowed, head low, hat in hand. But that image flattens a complex reality. Submission wasn't servitude, it was strategy. Most peasants didn't just suffer. They negotiated, they adapted, they bent the rules where they could, hid a pig, buried a sack of rye, slipped a bribe paid in eggs. Those were the rebellions they could afford. They were realists. Their world was ruled not by ideology, but by rain. The question wasn't, what's fair? It was, will this get us through winter? Justice, when it came late, if at all. Lords changed, priests moved on, rules shifted, but the wind still blew. The soil still needed turning. Children still cried from hunger. You didn't revolt against that. You endured it. The church played its part, and often more effectively than the sword. It taught that suffering was sacred, that endurance was noble, that the meek would inherit the earth, eventually. You were told your trials were not punishment, but purification, that obedience would earn reward, not here, but after. And if heaven's promise wasn't enough, hell's threat sealed the deal. Fire, agony, weeping, for those who said no, and yet peasants weren't passive. Their defiance was just quieter. They whispered gossip about the steward. They sang crude songs about the Lord. They laughed when the priest fumbled his Latin. They told stories of better times, of kinder rulers, of justice imagined by firelight. They found dignity in scraps, a shared crust, a knowing silence, a field furrowed just outside the rulebook. Their rebellion was survival, not by accepting the system, but by making it bend just enough to let them breathe. Sometimes change did come. A cruel lord died. His son was gentler. A bishop forgave debts. A storm reminded the powerful that they bled like everyone else. But that change came from above. The peasant's role was to wait, to endure, to hand down what little they had, to teach their children to be quiet when they must, and brave when they could. And yes, there were dreams. You may not have called it revolution, but you imagined another life. One where your child wasn't yoked to your burdens, where no one knocked with a list of dues, where your spine didn't ache before 30, where you could sleep without wolves or soldiers or frost in your bones. Those dreams didn't have to come true, they just had to stay alive. What's remarkable isn't how rarely peasants rose up, but how often they held on. They preserved their culture, their faith, their families under a system designed to press them flat. They passed down songs no one ever wrote. They remembered which herbs healed and which ones harmed. They taught each other how to pray, how to birth, how to mourn. They created a thread of memory that outlasted kings, outlived wars, and survived centuries. And they did it not with banners or swords, but with sheer persistence. When the manor asked too much, they survived anyway. When the church taxed their sins, they still lit candles. When the world turned its back, they leaned into each other and waited for spring. The land may have been owned by others, but the soil still remembered their hands. They weren't revolutionaries in the modern sense. They didn't shout slogans or storm palaces, but there was strength in the way they endured. To live a life of hardship without letting it hollow you out, that was a kind of resistance. To kneel, not from weakness, but because you knew you'd rise again tomorrow, that too was power. And so they endured, quietly, without statues, without songs. But they endured, in the rhythm of the plough, in the smoke curling from a cottage chimney, in lullabies hummed beside a dying fire. They endured in stories whispered to children who would grow up and whisper them again. History forgets them, or footnotes them beneath kings and crowns. But the peasants were the thread that held the tapestry together. Without them, there were no harvests, no armies, no churches or castles. They built the world, even if they were barred from owning it. They didn't overthrow their masters, but they outlasted them. And maybe, just maybe, that was revolution enough.